Good evening, everyone. My name is Oliver Simons. I'm a professor in Germanic languages. I'm the moderator of this very, very special event, the celebration of Andreas Huyssen's new book, Memory Art in the Contemporary World, Confronting Violence in the Global South. We don't have too much time for introductions, and yet there is so much to say. In one of the many passages that I underlined in this book, Andreas describes several axes: the axis between the artists in the global south, the axis between these artists and trends in the north, but also the axis between these artists and his own critical theory. And I mention this because it's an image that seemed to capture something that I always admired about his work, namely this ability to see and create connections, to read things in constellations, to even in the closest analysis of a literary text or of an artwork, to sense the presence of a past, of a remote and yet contemporaneous context. And I believe one can find these axes in all of his works. And I, again, don't have time to mention all of his books, but let me just name a few. 1986, After the Great Divide, Modernism, Mass Culture, Postmodernism, followed in 2003 by Present Pasts. William Kentridge and Nalini Malani, The Shadow Player's Medium of Memory, which came out in 2013, and Miniature Metropolis, Literature in an Age of Photography and Film from 2015. And as you know, many of these books have been translated into languages, more languages that a single person would be able to speak. But I would also say that his ability to build access and draw connections was crucial for his institutional life and work. As the Willard Professor of German and Comparative Literature, Andreas chaired the Department of Germanic Languages for many, many years. He was the founding director of the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society and one of the founding editors of the New German Critique, a journal that quickly became one of the most influential critical public voices in our field. And so many of the events and conferences Andreas organized and that have, I think, changed our field took place here at Deutsches Haus in this room. So it's quite special to have him back here finally and to celebrate your new book. I would also like to introduce the three panelists. Emily Apter is the Julius Silver Professor of French Literature, Thought and Culture and Comparative Literature at NYU. I think I'm not the only person in this room who assigns her work regularly in the classroom. Again, too many books to mention here, just a few titles. Continental Drift from National Characters to Virtual Subjects from 1999. Her famous book from 2006, The Translation Zone, A New Comparative Literature, followed 2013 by Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, and in 2017, Unexceptional Politics on Obstruction, Impasse, and the Impolitic. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight. Thanks for joining us. And then next to her, the second respondent, Claudia Breger, the current Willard Professor of German and Comparative Literature and the current Chair of Germanic Languages, also the author of many books. I'll just mention the last two. An Aesthetics of Narrative Performance came out in 2012, and most recently, Making Worlds, Affect and Collectivity in Contemporary European Cinema, a book that we celebrated not too long ago. And as you can tell from the title, affect studies is one of her specialties. And I believe the affective viewer is a critical term in Andreas's book as well. Then finally, our third respondent is Noam Elcott, Associate Professor of Art History and Archaeology and co-director of the Center for Comparative Media. His book, Artificial Darkness, An Obscure History of Modern Art and Media, won the 2017 Society for Cinema and Media Studies Innovative Scholarship Award. Noam is also the editor of the journal Grey Room. And I think, if I'm allowed to add this, I think you've known Andreas for quite some time because he was also an undergraduate student here at Columbia. So With that note, I close the circle and my very brief introduction. The format is Andreas has the first word and also the last word, but in between we will hear the commentators, and then Andreas will respond to the commentators, but there will also be time for you to ask questions, make comments. But first, please welcome Andreas Huyssen, and please welcome our guests and colleagues.
Thank you, Oliver, for the introduction. And yes, Deutsches Haus, this is a place where I gave my job talk before coming to Columbia, close to 40 years ago. Anyway, welcome to you all. I'm happy to see so many friends here in the audience. And welcome also to those of you who listen in on Zoom. I am part of the first post-fascist generation in Germany. So memory and forgetting have been central to my life and published work for decades. The rise of the field of memory study since the 1980s led me to observe and write about traveling Holocaust tropes and images in Latin America after the end of the dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, in post-apartheid South Africa, and in contemporary India. Doris Salcedo, who had read some of my earlier work on Holocaust memory in Germany, approached me for a catalog essay for one of her shows. So did Nalini Malani and Vivan Sundaram, both of whom I first met at a conference of artists, critics, and curators convened by Gita Kapoor in Mumbai in the late 1990s. Guillermo Kuitca and Marcelo Brodsky I met in those same years in Buenos Aires, where I was giving lectures about German memory culture at the Art Foundation PROA. I was deeply touched by William Kentridge's drawings for projection, Felix in Exile, which I watched multiple times, almost obsessively, at the Documenta 10 in Kassel in 1997. And I began to understand Kentridge's work better after I had met him in Johannesburg during Oqui Envisor's second Joburg Biennial later that same year. But slowly my interest in how Holocaust memory functioned in other traumatic histories of violence gave way to the issue of transnational comparison across the global South. The works of these artists first encountered each other and their viewers in third world biennials at the time of a growing international human rights movement and emerging cross-continental networks of truth and reconciliation commissions, memory museums, and commemorative projects around the world. By now, of course, the work of these artists has become quite successful, but they had just emerged into public consciousness when I first encountered their work and began to write about it. Clearly, their work challenged me to think beyond German history, and it was specifically their use of Holocaust tropes and images that helped me overcome hesitations to write about art from parts of the world so far from my own expertise. Now, each chapter of my book discusses a few specific works by two artists from vastly different geographic areas and historical contexts. These constellations are organized according to themes, spaces of violence, shadow plays, or traveling trauma tropes, or they focus on the spaces of installation, the gallery, the museum, urban space. Bringing these works into proximity with each other reveals aesthetic and political affinities as these artists negotiate their respective traumatic experiences by making imaginative use of received artistic legacies and practices. The south-to-south axis, and Oliver had mentioned that already, of my juxtapositions is crossed by a south-to-north axis manifest in the ways these artists have all drawn on the archive of northern modernisms and postmodernisms, appropriating or counter-appropriating artistic strategies, techniques, and forms, and re-articulating them from their post-colonial perspectives. The third dimension, of course, is the north to south axis, present in my approach, coming out of an expanded reading of critical theory, especially the aesthetic theory of Theodor Adorno. Now, the book joins two dimensions of memory shared by my artists. Memory of national eruptions of recent state violence articulated from within. And the artists I write about all work from their home countries rather than from some Western art metropolis. And secondly, memory of a broad and diverse archive of the Western arts from the 20th century. Expressionism and Soviet revolutionary art in Kentridge, avant-garde dance theater in Kuitca, minimalist sculpture in Salcedo and Sundaram, public urban installations in Salcedo and Kentridge, radical post-Brechtian theater in Malani. Much of this art relies heavily on installation and ephemeral performances while working out of older, sometimes obsolete mediums of art. By creating constellations of specific works across borders and boundaries, I have suggested points of affinity and contact among these artists from India, Latin America, and South Africa. And now I'll have just 6 images that put these juxtapositions on the screen. And I'm aware of the fact that it'll be hard to absorb all the details about it, but you can do that when you read the book. So we're in a very strict time regime here, evidently. But anyway, so the motif, the first image, the motif of the empty bed to signify disappearance in Kuitca and in Salcedo. Second, the affective transformations of minimalist sculpture in Salcedo's furniture sculptures and Sundaram's memorial installation. Next, the use of the shadow play and stop motion animation in Malani and Kentridge. I could not bring the films here, but I only have stills. Next, piles of worn shoes as a Holocaust image and its transformation in Salcedo and Sundaram. The move then from studio to urban space in Kentridge and Salcedo. The post-colonial critique of major museums in Salcedo and Sundaram. I mean, these are some of the major constellations in the chapters of the book. Now, all of it is loosely connected by the development of the installation as form in combination with different artistic mediums such as painting, sculpture, and drawing, or different technical supports such as video, stop-motion animation, and film. Ultimately, however, such affinities evoke a semblance of solidarity between geographically separated bodies of traumatic histories. The work becomes an important aspect of memory culture at large, one that aims, I think, at new forms of cohabitation and cosmopolitanism across cultural and geographic divides. Now, I have no illusions about the power of art being able to move things substantively in the world. The demand never again, nunca más, already shipwrecked in the 1990s in Bosnia and Rwanda. But I do have some trust in the power of art to create spaces of reflection and empathy, to question and challenge reified forms of official and sanctioned memory, to create shared meaning in deeply divided societies, to strengthen demands for accountability, to sabotage organized forgetting. And last but not least, to resist the neo-fascist memory revisionism that has recently arisen in many parts of the world. Such purposes can be pursued either by political art activism, a kind of direct, crisp, and cutting intervention in the public sphere that often resembles slapstick and draws on avant-garde techniques of estrangement or détournement, or by the temporally very different mode of what Doris Salcedo has called acts of memory, installations that require slow reception, active immersion and contemplation, both intellectual and sensual, in works and installations exhibited in gallery, museum, or in open urban space. Two different forms of artistic intervention then, one quick, fugitive, and geared to immediate political effect, the other slow, engendering long-term effects, lingering engagement and enlightenment, nourished by affect and emotion, created through complex aesthetic forms. And this, of course, the latter one is the subject of my book. Now, one last comment on the notion of aesthetic autonomy. If I foreground the idea of aesthetic autonomy for such acts of memory, I simply mean to reassert the affective and cognitive power of artworks at a time when an aesthetic of immediate gratification, the aesthetic as commodified lifestyle and neoliberal enterprise culture has taken over. In a world in which practically everything can claim to be aesthetic, it seems to me we need to guard or salvage the ways in which art can be understood, in Adorno's pithy definition, as both aesthetically autonomous and as social fact. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be part of a panel honoring Andreas, a friend and inspiration for many years. So let me get started. So for many years now, Andreas Huyssen has been engaged in a project of aesthetic mapping, producing cartographies of world historical political shifts, geographies of mass culture and aesthetic movements. The last chapter of his groundbreaking 1986 book, After the Great Divide, titled Mapping the Postmodern, offered a preview, one could say, of the mapping venture in 2022's Memory, Art, and the Contemporary World. It begins with a story about a visit to the 1982 Documenta in Kassel. As Andreas approaches the exhibit with his 5-year-old son, Daniel, he confronts a work of social sculpture by Joseph Beuys, consisting of, quote, thousands of huge basalt blocks arranged in a triangle formation, the smallest angle of which pointed at a newly planted tree, end of quote. Beuys, he reminds us, was concerned with the death of trees as a result of acid rain and had issued a, quote, appeal to the citizens of Kassel. This is Andreas, a dismal provincial city rebuilt in concrete after the heavy bombings of the last Great War, to plant a tree with each of his 7,000 planting stones, end of quote. Daniel loves the rocks, climbing all over them and asking quizzically, is this art? Continuing on, father and son encounter pieces by Jamie Lee Byers, Cunelis, and Mertz, all of it engaged with brute material surfaces that invite tactile response. Daniel reaches out and touches, but immediately, predictably, the guard yells, "Nicht berühren, das ist Kunst." Hearing these admonishments, Andreas suddenly gets what's at stake in postmodernism, light bulb moment, a movement saturated by readings of Benjamin's oratic theory of the work of art in a post-secular age of medial reproducibility. Quote, here it was, that old notion of art, no touching, no trespassing. The museum is temple, the artist is prophet, the work is relic and cult object, the halo restored. To puncture this halo, postmodern art can no longer rely on ironic distance and self-critique. It must subject its own heuristics to historical critique. This is really one of the main engines of the book. And this entails a complex mapping process that challenges the presuppositions linking, and these are his terms, modernism and the avant-garde to the mindset of modernization. End of quote. So the mapping in After the Great Divide, I think tends to be historical and theory-driven rather than geographic or transnational. Units of historicity are broken down into decades with emphasis on the pivot in the 70s from avant-gardism to the neoconservative, post-structuralist, culturally eclecticist 80s. Interestingly, though, the book concludes with intimations of a different kind of mapping to come, one that will be oriented to the non-West and no longer voiced by Euro critics who, quote, speak with the confidence of standing at the cutting edge of time and with an unquestioned sense of entitlement to speak for others. Flash forward to the 2020s and we discover Andreas well on track towards this project of a new critical mapping along north-south and south-south axes. Chapters on memory, art, and the contemporary world span South Africa, Latin America, and the Asian subcontinent. They model an aesthetic cartography in critical tension with the post-war landscape of German Erinnerungskultur and Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, which is the working through the past, which was so indelibly marked by the historians' dispute in the mid-1980s. And as you'll recall, at this time, Holocaust-centered memory work vied with the German suffering war narratives in a sea of mnemonic pluralism, in which the idea was to give alternative voices and views and actors equal due. Needless to say, this led to relativizing narratives, false moral equivalences, noxious forms of both sidesism, as of the kind we see in contemporary political reporting today, and the making equal of specious lookalikes. It's just this kind of mnemonic pluralism that Andreas seeks to avoid, even though it's not always easy when undertaking comparative work. Paradigms, epistemes, critical models tend to have an equalizing and universalizing force, not to mention a tendency to dehistoricize when diachronically applied. There is also, in the case of memory art, a particular set of challenges deriving from the fact, as he notes historically, artwork, quote, dealing with public memory debates was first generated around 20th century catastrophes, primarily the Holocaust, with a focus on the limits of representation. As memory art spread to other historical events, he continues, it raised complex issues of comparability and memory competitions. Andreas courts the risks that come with North-South comparatism when he juxtaposes his Holocaust, the Holocaust and the myriad violences of the global South. But he's careful to recognize the singularity of each traumatic event and avoids treating the Holocaust as the first-order catastrophe against which all others are scaled. He insists on the aesthetic autonomy of lived experience, particular to each socially situated work of memory art, and refuses to homogenize processes of what Rosalind Deutsch calls the not forgetting. This is her new book, Not Forgetting Contemporary Art and the Interrogation of Mastery, which is a wonderful pendant to this book. For Deutsch, the hyphen in not forgetting, I think, performs a specific function. It traces links between the legal process, as in the prosecution of war crimes at the Hague Tribunal, and more fluid practices of bearing witness that constitute for Deutsch the, quote, ethical antidote to the repressive, narcissistic, and instrumental memory embodied in official monuments such as war memorials, end of quote. Like Deutsch, Andreas brings out at every turn the complex ways in which memorial culture can be compromised, with memory art becoming a kind of forgetting machine of inconvenient truth, a place where real memory goes to die, rather than an effective way of really reckoning with the past. The question of how to do repair work, and more generally of how to define reparativity, are at the core of this book's concerns, even if they are not its primary topic. Reparativity, as both concept and condition of the political times, belongs to a lexicon that includes redemption, a word that he is evoked in this book, restitution, recovery, and unpayability, all especially resonant now in relation to debates over post-slavery redress. I think of activist criticism on reparations and abolition by, among others, Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy, by Catherine Franke, her book Repair, Redeeming the Promise of Abolition, and by Olufemi Taiwo, Reconsidering Reparations. Taiwo develops the notion of constructive liability, which shifts the reparations debate from notions of irreparability and unpayability based on the moral assumption that no equivalent exists that allows human suffering to be translated into monetary damages, shifts this to notions of systemic liability geared toward economic remediation. This is an extra-moral position that, quote, obligates people and corporations to bear the cost of injuries in ways that bypass blame and fault-finding entirely, end of quote. While memory art in the contemporary world doesn't weigh in on the political pragmatics of liability and remuneration, it does, I think, question the critical assumptions around reparability in its analysis of select works of art, especially those of Malani, Kentridge, and Sundaram. Its approach to confrontations with violence in sites across the globe, and careful distinction drawing between memory art that awakens critical consciousness and memory art that outsources reckoning to institutions whose job it is to ease us into forgetting, direct us to those shadow areas of, this is a quote from the book I love, the twilight of cultural traditions within a differentiated global modernity, areas then where the resolution of suffering is suspended and closure is never achieved. And if I have time, I'll just read my questions. So here are my questions for Andreas. How has memory art anchored your approach to comparatism, art, literature, media, and enabled different geographies of mapping? In After the Great Divide, postmodernism and postmodernity were mapped onto critical theory in a post-war, largely Euro-American global context. Here, by contrast, a global South aesthetic constellation is mapped onto the history of post-colonial, post-Anthropocene capitalism inflected by genocidal wars, ethnic cleansing, mass migration, state terrorism, and an economy of racial discount manifest in the scars of racial extractivism. How has your idea of comparatism or approach to it changed as you've expanded the geopolitical frame of what is mapped or mappable? Question 2, in the book, you reference Adorno's strong construct of aesthetic identity. Aesthetic identity, Adorno wrote, seems to aid the non-identical, which in reality is repressed by reality's compulsion to identity. That's end of quote. So I wonder if you could unpack this argument further, since it lies, I think, at the core of the book, specifically its critique of identity production, orders of same, flattening of comparative entities, its historical relativism, its drive towards forgetting under the guise of memorializing. Is part of your project here to identify an aesthetics of non-identity as part of a praxis of negative dialectics? I tend to read non-identity alongside critical concepts of incomparability or the untranslatable, concepts that undercut totalizing global comparison. But I'm not sure this is what Adorno, in fact, I'm sure it isn't what Adorno is after when he writes of desublimating the repressed non-identical. And finally, very quickly, would you situate your book in the larger contemporary groundswell of repair work, reparativity theory, and trauma studies? A groundswell that includes, in addition to post-slavery and reparations work, psychoanalytically inflected writing, such as Leo Bersani's The Culture of Redemption, Eve Sedgwick's classic essay on reparative reading, or Catherine Malibu's writing on cognitive lesions and neurodiversity in her book, The New Wounded. Thanks very much.
Thank you. It is really an honor to be part of this and help reflect on celebrate this book. And thank you also to Emily for these really sort of contextual reflections. I'm going to basically jump right in and mostly quote from the book and emphasize a few particular points that resonated with me. The first one actually does have, I think, something in common with what we just heard, starting from those questions of comparison, but taking them in a slightly different direction. Among the many feats of this book is that it undertakes a very subtle, unaufgeregte intervention into debates that have been raging in the German language context in the last few years on complex issues of comparability and memory competitions, that's Andreas, or multi-directional memory in Michael Rothberg's term, and the relations between the memory of the Holocaust and histories of colonial genocide. As Andreas shows, the traveling of trauma tropes and the appropriation of the paradigmatic 20th century catastrophe as metaphor can deepen our understanding of other histories of violence and genocide without contesting the singularity of the Holocaust or falling into the trap of claiming identity with it. But Andreas also suggests some conceptual fine-tuning. In taking up Rothberg's terminology, he spells out that he actually prefers to speak of memory palimpsests and their multi-directional layerings, thus further underlining how we are not comparing a set of distinct histories, but complexly interwoven processes in a world of violent as well as creative transnational and transcontinental flows. In my enthusiastic agreement, I'm wondering whether we could play with this notion of palimpsestic multidirectionality more explicitly also with respect to the book's rethinking of transcultural modernisms and contemporary culture. And that goes into my first question. Andreas, you so importantly underline all these different axes, south-south, north-south, at least in two ways or multiple directions, in spelling out the travels of modernist forms. But in doing so, you actually mostly work, and I think for very good reasons, with a different terminology of appropriation and counter-appropriation. Against the backdrop of recent political debates on appropriation, I am interested in the affordances and the limits of that term. Foregrounding the violence inherent in plundering the riches of cultural sedimentations is entirely intuitive when it comes to the northern modernist appropriation of global art. And in many respects, it also makes sense to foreground a more antagonistic dimension with regard to the counter-appropriation of modernist tropes by artists from the global south. At the same time, speaking of appropriation also, if you will, splits apart the palimpsestic formations of transcontinental culture into opposing blocks. So the question maybe also for all of us would be where and when do we want to and need to speak of appropriation, and where and when might we instead foreground the palimpsestic nature of modernism and contemporary experimental art as part of the transcultural memory processes that are unfolding, per your beautiful closing words, for an unsettled decolonizing world. My second point, as Oliver sort of suggested, is on affect and abstraction. One of the book's threads that I'm utterly fascinated with is how Andreas thinks affect simultaneously with and beyond Adorno for the 21st century, of course, based on your reconceptualization of the notion of aesthetic autonomy for the contemporary moment, and in particular for the genre of installation art. While the idea of aesthetic autonomy continues to protect the realm of artistic complexity from the incursions of identity politics and co., we need to think it as socially mediated, also in the sense that art, and specifically installation as form, is actualized in processes of affective and cognitive exchange with viewers. If art, Andreas says, is to be effective as critique, it must develop dialectical strategies to draw spectators in through sensual aesthetic experience. This entwining of affect and critical thinking, or the potentials of critical affective seeing, as you also word, is developed throughout the readings via your recurring emphasis in particular on the interplay of modernist abstraction and affect. This catapults us into the center of, I would say, still emerging discussions on affect and modernism. Sometimes in your reading, for example, of Sundaram's memorial, you sort of still played tribute to more conventional delineations by juxtaposing the photograph and the found objects, and like referencing the usual mapping of abstraction versus affect. But these mappings more fully implode elsewhere. Thus, you poignantly speak of the minimalism of materials loaded with the maximalism of affect in Salcedo's La Casa Viuda, or more generally of the affective abstraction in all of her work. Your critically moving reading of the wound and more permanent scar inflicted on the Tate Modern is definitely one of the most haunting examples to me. And I would love to hear even more, either today or in your future books, on this interplay. Under which conditions does abstraction produce or invite distancing? Where does it paradoxically or even plain immediately affect us towards articulating pain, bearing witness, and affording empathy? Passe Brecht and maybe even passe Adorno also. And the third and last point, do I have 2 more minutes? Is on art's political actions. The question of art's political power is already implicit in these conceptualizations of affect and critique, and explicit throughout the book, as well as in the intro today, in a way that simultaneously acknowledges contemporary realism about art's political effectiveness and continues to insist on the latter. And I think that's exactly the right combination. Contemporary memory art tends to be, quote Andreas, avant-gardist without the historical avant-garde's dream about changing the world through art. Yet its urgency seems clear, perhaps not only in the global South, but also in our own societies with their newly heightened controversies around historical memory. And one example you also mentioned is that of slavery in the US. I am myself interested in redeveloping these questions of art's political efficacy for the contemporary context with its post-critical, arguably farewells to politics and the post-human distributions of agency. Against that background, I'm particularly fascinated by several of your interpretations, as well as even seemingly more casual remarks, including the reflection on the quote-unquote old critical theory notion of redemption at the end of the intro, where you conclude, call it redemption or not, like air, it is essential to keep us breathing. This, of course, connects to very contemporary discussions around the politics of breathing, and perhaps that would also be something to talk more about. And finally, a more developed example is the significance of the material trace and its artistic transformation in a collective work process in Salcedo's Fragmentos, with its dark tiled floor made from thousands of returned weapons. And here we have like a range of different effectivities, if this is a word, from the fact that the floor provides evidence for the return of the weapons to the process of affective working through that it affords, which then, as Andreas spells out, results in verbal testimony, which gets captured on video. So maybe I just want to mark the complexity of these layered actions across media and the richness of political actions that it comes together into. Or perhaps a work like this could even give us occasion for slightly less modest, albeit still realist, reconceptualizations of all the ways in which art can contribute to change in the world, short of the simple big revolutionary gestures that the old avant-garde was dreaming about. Thank you for this beautiful book.
"24 years ago, in the spring of 1999, I took a bridge lecture course on the culture of memory with Professor Andreas Huyssen. It was and remains among the formative intellectual, aesthetic, and ethical experiences of my life. A descendant of Holocaust survivors who first encountered Germany and Europe alongside my Krefeld-born grandmother, I arrived to class immersed in milieu de mémoire. But it was Andreas who provided me with a theoretical armature to critically engage and constructively reimagine the possibilities of memory cultures in the past, present, and future. Andreas's teaching accompanied me to Germany and to graduate school and back to Columbia, where as a young professor in 2012, I was fortunate enough to accompany him to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to see William Kentridge's The Refusal of Time, with which, of course, he concludes his stunning book. In his afterword, Andreas writes that this book has taken shape over several decades. I like to think I've been an eager student and occasional interlocutor during most of those decades. And yet, every chapter of this penetrating and lustrous volume held new insights, introduced me to new works and artists and historical traumas, and above all, posed new questions that cut straight to the most pressing issues of our moment. It was a rare pleasure to read, and it is an honor to be able to respond to it this evening. I'll hold myself to a few comments and thorny questions from the, I hope, not too parochial perspective of an art historian. Memory art in the contemporary world is not only the title of Andreas's book, it is the condition in which art most powerfully touches the lives of individuals, communities, and societies in the present. Not only the events, monuments, counter-monuments, exhibits, artworks, and museums across the global South so eloquently addressed by Andreas, but also national debates here in the US, such as on Civil War monuments and what will replace them, or more locally still in New York City, where memory art filled the last Whitney Biennial, the New Museum's The Astor Gates retrospective, and numerous other established and improvised venues. Among Andreas's key insights is that the rise of memory art reverses a seemingly timeless condition where monumental art often marked the death of living memory. Memory art infuses contemporary art practice with life. What's more, Andreas's book is a masterclass in how to write global contemporary art history, a practice that has eluded and frustrated almost all art historians. By constellating pairs of artists around shared mediums, sites, or predicaments, shadow plays and installations, urban spaces and museums, disappearances and ubiquitous violence, memory art in the contemporary world models a mode of global art history that remains true to particular histories and sites, yet weaves a story that elucidates and connects disparate junctures in the global South and in relation to the North. If time allowed, I would love to delve further into the individual case studies and the rich theoretical introduction to the book, but time is short. So I'll end with one or maybe two questions. Simply put, though I fear there's nothing simple about the question, and indeed it may be unanswerable, my question is, what is the role of aesthetic memory in a book on memory art? A few concrete models. For Aby Warburg, pathos formel connected centuries of art to the art of antiquity through the language of gestures and passions. His unfinished Mnemosyne Atlas was a visual training manual for these tropes as taught by the works themselves. In short, an aesthetic memory. Closer to home, Rosalind Krauss has defined the medium as, quote, a set of conventions derived from but not identical with the material conditions of a given technical support, conventions out of which to develop a form of expressiveness that can be both projective and mnemonic. Now, neither Warburg nor Krauss theorized memory art per se. Instead, they each and in very different ways identified aesthetic memory as constitutive of art practices, contemporary and historical. The lingua franca you correctly identify for the global artists you study is that of Western modernism. You explicitly name and elucidate the connections to expressionism, Soviet and Weimar avant-gardes, minimalism and installation art, and it seems that minimalism and installation art loom especially large. There is an irony here, of which you are keenly aware, namely that Western modernisms were often practiced and polemicized in opposition to memory, in opposition to history, in opposition to traditions, Marinetti and Futurism being, the locus classicus of avant-garde animus to all history and memory. The revival of these Western modernisms in the name of memory art in the global South is a scrumptious and unexpected twist, and I'd love to hear your further reflections on it. But this is just a prelude to my central question, namely, where are the aesthetic memories from the global South itself? A few examples. Hear Me Now, the astonishing pottery exhibition that just closed at the Met, juxtaposed the 19th century work of enslaved African-American potters of old Edgefield, South Carolina, most famously Dave the Potter, with those of contemporary artists like the Astor Gates, Simone Lee, and others working in the same materials, above all clay, experimenting with the same aesthetic and functional forms, jugs and other vessels, and solidifying an aesthetic memory that can carry the sorrows and triumphs of African and African-American life. Another example, Cecilia Vicuña, Chilean artist with major exhibitions in the Turbine Hall, London, the Guggenheim, New York, and the most recent Venice Biennale. Her practices range across poetry, painting, and installation. Above all, site-specific kipu, not installations, K-N-O-T, not installations, and one-time performances of what she calls living kipu. The kipu was an ancient Inca device for recording information consisting of variously colored threads knotted in different ways, a mnemonic technology in the most literal sense, unfortunately as yet undeciphered. Even as Vicuña described her first kipu as, quote, the kipu that remembers nothing, subsequent installations deploy the aesthetic memory of kipu and the aesthetic practice of kipu to construct memory artworks in relation to a range of recent traumas. A final example, drawing on your own striking analysis of Nalini Malani's In Search of Vanished Blood. And this is the piece we saw very briefly with the cylinders that project these intricate shadow plays onto the walls of and figures within the installation. And I find this work extraordinarily compelling, and I have to say that I knew absolutely nothing of it until I read Andreas's essay in the 2013 catalog. So this is just one of many instances of work that is now vital to my repertoire that I know only through you and your brilliant analyses. In addition to the many Western artistic allusions, might Malani also be channeling the millennia-long tradition of shadow puppetry in India, one in which women have played an outsized role? As I understand it, one of the epic ancient Indian texts Malani draws on, the Mahabharata, constitutes an essential part of the repertoire of shadow theater traditions in India and throughout Southeast Asia, such that her revolutionary work is also a continuation of an aesthetic tradition that spans millennia with which women were especially involved. In other words, and here I will end, how might the aesthetic memory of Indian shadow plays inflect her memory art in the present? Thank you again for this extraordinary book.
Thank you, Emily, Claudia, and Noam, for your careful reading and generous descriptions of the book. Thanks also for sharing your comments with me beforehand so that I can be more concise here in the 5 or shall we say 7 minutes allotted to my response. Noam reminds us that aesthetic memory has always been constitutive of art making. True enough, but differential specificities in the perceptions and regimes of time and space can and must be analyzed in each case to avoid the conclusion that there's nothing new under the sun, which of course is not what you would argue, Noam, anyway. Our situation, coming after modernism, when modernism/avant-gardism has itself become tradition, means that this archive can be repurposed in contemporary aesthetic practices, and that is the topic of my book, but it can also be plundered by the culture industry and by commodity aesthetics. Louis Vuitton's fine arts, as they're called. This gets me to Emily's question, how my approach to comparativism has changed as my geopolitical frame has expanded beyond the Northern Transatlantic. Not sure how to answer, but I tend to see more continuity than change. The continuity is in the mapping itself, which you describe so well, Emily, an approach from a distance combined with close readings from proximity to and even intimacy with cultural objects. What holds it all together is my lifelong fascination with modernism/avant-gardism, which is itself grounded in specific generational experiences. And Emily, you are right. At the heart of the book is a critique of identity production and the ways in which aesthetic experience subverts it. I don't think I'd want to construct an aesthetics of non-identity, however. Not sure how to best say this, but Adorno's notion of non-identity brings to my mind Musil's Mann ohne Eigenschaften, the man without qualities, where Musil writes that every human subject has 9 identities, a radical version of intersectionality, if you like. And the 9th identity is indeed non-identity, linked to a sense of open possibility, what Musil called Möglichkeitssinn. This points to how identity and non-identity are always entangled with each other, just as the translatable is with the untranslatable. I like your suggestive juncture of non-identity and untranslatability, which would give us more to discuss here. Claudia, you raise the important question of appropriation. Of course, I know that the term cultural appropriation, and for many good reasons, carries an extremely negative charge these days. But does it have to? Two reasons why I speak in the book of appropriation in reverse. One is simply the desire to emphasize these artists' agency and to keep their work from being described condescendingly as merely derivative, as happened so often. The second, however, is my belief that appropriation is part and parcel of any cross-cultural transnational exchange. I wrote my dissertation on theories of translation as appropriation in the work of the Jena Romantics. Appropriation here aimed at expanding literary horizons, creating new possibilities for the native language, to make cross-language communication possible, and to enable the somewhat later Goethean concept of Weltliteratur. So I would ask, isn't there a multidirectionality of appropriation as well? And if so, to speak of appropriation in reverse may not be so very different any longer from talking about multidirectional palimpsests. But I do take your gentle critique to heart, Claudia. Now I must respond to Noam's question. Where in the book are the aesthetic memories from the global South? An all too easy answer would be the task I set myself to is to relate two clusters of memory to each other, not three. Memories of recent and current historical violence and memories of modernism. Thinking about the question, though, reminds me that my artists vary greatly in the ways they incorporate local aesthetic memories. The clearest case is that of Nalini Malani, whose work I do relate in the book to late 19th century Kaligat painting in India, to South Asian marionette shadow play, and to reverse painting. You mentioned her use of the Indian epic Mahabharata, and yes, the major female figure of that epic, Draupadi, figures prominently in Malani's work together with Cassandra, Medea, and others. At the other end of the scale is Doris Salcedo, whose minimalist practice does not seem to be shadowed at all by Latin American, or for that matter, Colombian aesthetic memories. Kentridge, with his use of charcoal drawing, widely used in African art, would be somewhere in the middle. Such presence of aesthetic memories from the global South could certainly be explored in more detail. I also appreciate your observation, Claudia, that abstraction and affect are treated differently in Salcedo versus Sundaram. In Sundaram's memorial, you suggest, affect and abstraction are still just juxtaposed. The photograph of the victim juxtaposed to the minimalist abstractions of objects, whereas in Salcedo, the distinction itself is imploded. True enough, but I would give more credit to Sundaram, who does entangle the cognitive and the affective with each other in the ways he works over the photograph with different materials in a series of vitrines which form part of the installation and which I could not picture in the book. Let me conclude with a response to Emily's question about repair work, with its links to so many current discussions about reparations, restitutions, recovery, redress, reconciliation, and even with a more theological tinge, redemption. Repair begins with the acknowledgement of others' pain and suffering. The way art achieves this much through aesthetic experience is perhaps most obvious in Doris Salcedo, whose artistic practice is grounded in intense forms of co-witnessing. I did not foreground repair in the book for one simple reason. I remain skeptical of the broader implied promises of repair, both at the individual and at the social political levels. I'm skeptical that full repair is ever possible, even if reparations and restitutions were made. The terrors and injustices of the past cannot be undone. But they must be remembered, and my book is about such remembrance. But mind you, it is remembrance for the sake of the future. In the sense of Adorno's saying, in his typical mode of rhetorical exaggeration, and I quote, "All art bears witness that the world should be other than it is." This is certainly true for the works discussed in my book. Thank you.